"You will take that thing down, or I will make sure you lose this house." Those were the words she screamed at me across my own lawn, her face a blotchy mask of crimson fury. Her finger, tipped with a perfectly manicured but vicious-looking nail, stabbed the air in the direction of my roof. The thing in question was my wind turbine. It was a sleek, silent, vertical-axis model, no bigger than a small satellite dish. It was my passion project, a little monument to a career spent wrestling with electrons and a quiet nod to the future. In that moment, watching Carol, the self-appointed queen of our little suburban fiefdom, I didn't know her threat was the first shovel of dirt in a grave she was digging for herself. But I knew, with the certainty of a well-grounded circuit, that I was about to help her dig. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm a retired electrical engineer. For 40 years, I designed and managed power grids, the vast, humming circulatory systems of modern life. I understood how energy flowed, how it was controlled, and how fragile the whole intricate dance really was. After my wife, Eleanor, passed away last year, the big house felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was over. The silence was deafening. So, I moved. I found a modest, single-story house in a development called Harmony Creek. The name was a cruel joke, as I would soon find out. I chose it for its quiet streets and its proximity to my daughter, Sarah, and her family. All I wanted was a place to tinker in my workshop, tend to the small garden Eleanor and I had planned together, and maybe read a few books without interruption. I was seeking peace, a quiet harbor after a long and sometimes stormy voyage. Section This house was my fresh start. It had a small yard, a 2-car garage I immediately converted into a state-of-the-art workshop, and a decent roofline. It was perfect. I spent the first few months settling in, building custom shelves, and setting up my equipment. My prized possession was a small fabrication machine that let me create custom parts for my projects. The centerpiece of my retirement plan, my little hobby, was sustainable energy. I had installed solar panels on the roof immediately, a simple and common enough upgrade. But I wanted to go a step further. I'd always been fascinated by wind power, not the colossal, soaring turbines you see on hillsides, but the smaller, more elegant solutions for personal use. After months of research, I purchased and installed the Nightingale 30. It was a marvel of engineering, compact, gearless, and utterly silent. It spun with a gentle, hypnotic grace, its white blades catching the afternoon breeze. It stood on a short mast at the back of my roof, barely clearing the peak, and its energy output was enough to power my workshop and sell a little back to the grid. It was clean, efficient, and beautiful in its own way. To me, it was a symbol of self-reliance and a quiet victory for common sense. Harmony Creek, however, was not a place that celebrated common sense. It celebrated conformity. Every lawn was cut to the exact same height. Every mailbox was the regulation black. Every house was painted one of 3 shades of beige. The neighborhood was governed by a thick binder of rules, covenants, and restrictions, enforced with religious zeal by the Homeowners Association. And the high priestess of that HOA was Carol. I first met her a week after I moved in. She appeared on my doorstep holding a welcome basket that seemed more like an inspection kit. It contained a bottle of cheap wine, a copy of the HOA bylaws, and a small ruler. "To measure your grass height," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have standards here, Mr. Pendleton." She was a woman in her mid-50s who carried herself like a drill sergeant. Her hair was a helmet of blonde spray, her clothes were impeccably pressed, and her eyes had a predatory gleam. She walked through my house, not as a guest, but as a building inspector, pointing out things she approved of and things that were on the borderline. I was polite, of course. I thanked her for the basket, assured her I had read the bylaws, and gently guided her to the door. I chalked it up to an overzealous welcome wagon. I had no idea that I had just met the warden of my new, beige prison. The first sign of trouble was a letter, tucked under my door handle. It was printed on crisp, heavy stock paper with the Harmony Creek HOA logo embossed at the top. The letter, signed by Carol, informed me that my new solar panels, while a noble effort, had not been pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, which she also chaired. I was to submit a retroactive application immediately. I sighed, filled out the paperwork, and submitted it. It was a pointless exercise in bureaucracy, but I wanted to be a good neighbor. I wanted peace. A week later, I received an approval letter, along with a one-time warning for my procedural error. I thought that was the end of it. Then I installed the turbine. I did my homework. I spent weeks poring over city ordinances, state regulations, and the HOA bylaws. There was nothing, not a single word, that prohibited or even mentioned wind turbines. The bylaws were specific about satellite dishes, flagpoles, and even garden gnomes, but silent on the matter of personal power generation beyond solar panels. I got the necessary city permits, had the installation inspected, and connected it to my system. For 2 glorious weeks, the nightingale spun in blissful silence, generating clean energy. I would sit in my backyard, watching it turn against the blue sky, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It was a quiet joy. That joy ended the day Carol saw it. I was in my front yard, tending to Eleanor's memorial garden, a small patch of roses and lavender, when her car screeched to a halt in front of my house. She got out, leaving the driver's side door open, and marched onto my lawn. "What," she began, her voice low and dangerous, "is that?" I followed her pointed finger. "That's my wind turbine." "Your what?" she scoffed, as if I'd just told her I'd installed a catapult. "A wind turbine," I repeated calmly. "It generates electricity from the wind. It's very efficient." "I don't care if it's powered by pixie dust," she snapped. "It's an eyesore. It's not in the bylaws." "You're right, it's not," I said, a little too cheerfully. "I checked. It's not prohibited, so it's permitted." Her face tightened. The logic of my statement was like a foreign language she refused to learn. In her world, if something wasn't explicitly permitted, it was forbidden. Especially if she hadn't thought of it first. "It lowers property values," she declared, a classic HOA battle cry. "It's noisy." "It's completely silent," I countered. "It's a maglev design, no gears. You can't hear it at all." We both stood there for a moment, listening to the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. The turbine spun above us without a whisper. My statement was irrefutably true, and that seemed to make her even angrier. "It's industrial," she spat, searching for a new line of attack. "This is a residential neighborhood, Mr. Pendleton. We have an aesthetic to maintain. I have all the city permits, Carol. It's fully compliant with all local and state codes." That's when she dropped the line that started it all. "I am the HOA. My decision is final. You will take that thing down, or I will make sure you lose this house." The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a beat. The casual, venomous threat to take away my home, my sanctuary, because she didn't like my hobby. A switch flipped in my head. The peace-seeking retiree vanished, and the systems engineer took his place. I saw a problem that needed to be analyzed and a faulty component that needed to be isolated and removed. "I will not be taking it down, Carol," I said, my voice losing its friendly tone and taking on the flat, calm resonance of a professional delivering bad news. "It is my property, and it is perfectly legal." I turned my back on her and went back to weeding the garden, my hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. I heard her sputter, then the slam of her car door, and the squeal of tires as she peeled away. The battle lines had been drawn. I just didn't realize I was bringing a strategic blueprint to a knife fight. The official letters started the next day. The first was a formal notice of violation for an unapproved structure. It cited a vague clause in the bylaws about maintaining the harmonious aesthetic of the community. It came with a $100 fine. I responded with a formal letter of my own. I quoted the specific sections of the bylaws, or lack thereof, regarding wind turbines. I attached copies of my city permits and the manufacturer's specifications, which clearly listed the decibel level as less than 5 dB, quieter than a library. I respectfully stated that I would not be paying the fine as no violation had occurred. I sent my letter via certified mail. I wanted a paper trail. My engineering career had taught me one thing above all else: document everything. Assumed knowledge is the mother of all disasters. A week later, I received a second notice. The fine had been increased to $200 for failure to comply. This letter was more aggressive. It claimed the turbine was a safety hazard and a nuisance. It was signed not just by Carol, but by the entire HOA board, though I suspected they were just rubber stamps for her tyranny. I began my investigation. It started simply. I went to the county records office and pulled the public filings for the Harmony Creek HOA. I read through years of meeting minutes, financial statements, and amendments. It was as dry as toast, but within the dense legalese and boring numbers, patterns began to emerge. Carol had been president for 10 years. In that time, HOA dues had nearly doubled, while the services provided seemed to have remained the same, or even declined. The board was a rotating cast of her cronies, people who either owed her favors or were too afraid to cross her. No decision had ever been voted against her. She ran the place like a dictator. Then I started looking at the financials. They were a mess of vague line items and lump sum payments. One vendor name appeared over and over again, C. Enterprises. They were paid exorbitant amounts for landscaping, pool maintenance, common area repairs, and administrative services. The payments were consistent, large, and lacked any detailed invoicing. A quick search on the state's business registry website gave me the jackpot. C. Enterprises was a sole proprietorship. The owner and sole registered agent was one Carol and Brewster. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a power trip. This was a grift. She was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, funneling our dues directly into her own pocket through a shell company. The harmonious aesthetic she was so obsessed with maintaining was the source of her illegal income. My turbine wasn't an eyesore, it was a challenge to her authority, and a threat to her scam. Any resident who questioned things, who wasn't easily intimidated, was a danger to her entire operation. The fight was no longer about my turbine. It was about a fundamental injustice. She was stealing from all of us, from the young families struggling with their mortgages to the retirees on fixed incomes. She was a parasite disguised as a pillar of the community. While I was digging into her finances, she was escalating her attacks on me. She began a campaign of harassment. She would park her car partially blocking my driveway for hours at a time. She started posting thinly veiled warnings on the community's social media page about unauthorized industrial equipment and the dangers they pose to our children. One evening, my neighbor Frank, a retired police detective with a weary but sharp gaze, came over while I was working in my garage. "You've really poked the bear, Art," he said, leaning against my workbench. "She's a piece of work, Frank," I replied, wiping grease from my hands. "More than you know," he said. "She tried to get me to write a formal complaint about your turbine. Said it was making a high-frequency noise that was giving her dog anxiety." I laughed. "The only thing making a high-frequency noise is Carol herself." "I told her to pound sand," Frank said. "But be careful. She's vindictive. She tried to get the Miller's dog taken away by animal control last year because it barked when she walked past their house." His warning was timely. The next morning, I found a notice from the city taped to my front door. It was a formal complaint, filed by a concerned neighbor, alleging that my property had unsafe and unpermitted electrical wiring, constituting a fire hazard. An inspector was scheduled to visit the following week. This was a direct attack on my professional identity. I had spent my entire life ensuring electrical systems were safe. Her accusation was not just a lie, it was an insult. I felt a cold, professional anger settle in my gut. The inspector came, a young man who looked bored before he even got out of his truck. I greeted him warmly, offered him a coffee, and walked him through my entire system. I showed him my breaker box, the conduit I ran for the solar panels, the grounding for the turbine, and the transfer switch. I handed him a folder containing my original plans, the permits, and the manufacturer's certifications. He spent 20 minutes looking everything over, his expression unchanging. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, "this is one of the cleanest residential installs I've ever seen. It's practically commercial grade. You could teach a class with this." "Thank you," I said, my relief palpable. "Frankly, I don't know why I'm here," he continued, lowering his voice. "The complaint was anonymous, but these kinds of spiteful calls from HOA-run neighborhoods are a waste of my time. You're all clear." He left, and I watched him drive away, a small victory under my belt. But the satisfaction was short-lived. I knew Carol wouldn't stop. She wasn't trying to win, she was trying to wear me down. She wanted to make my life so miserable that I would either give up and take the turbine down, or just move away. The turning point, the moment my mission changed from defense to offense, came a few days later. It was a Saturday morning. I was in my kitchen, drinking my coffee and looking out the window at Eleanor's garden. The roses were in full bloom. I had planted them myself, but I always felt like she was the one making them grow. I saw Carol walking her yapping little poodle down the sidewalk. As she reached my property line, she stopped. She looked left, then right. Then she looked directly at my kitchen window, directly at me. A slow, malicious smile spread across her face. She unclipped the poodle's leash, gave it a little nudge, and watched as the dog trotted directly into my wife's memorial garden. It sniffed around for a moment, then squatted and relieved itself right on a bed of lavender. Carol didn't move. She just stood there, watching, with that same smug smile. When the dog was finished, she clipped the leash back on and walked away, leaving the mess behind. She didn't even glance back. I didn't move for a full minute. I just stood there, the coffee mug growing cold in my hands. It wasn't about the dog. It was about the intent. It was a calculated act of desecration. She had targeted the one thing on my property that was sacred, the living tribute to the woman I had loved for 45 years. In that moment, all thoughts of a peaceful resolution evaporated. The rules of engagement had changed. This was no longer a dispute over bylaws and aesthetics. This was personal. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. My grief, which had been a quiet, constant companion, sharpened into a cold, hard diamond of rage. I was no longer just an engineer defending his property. I was a husband defending his wife's memory. I walked out to the garden, cleaned up the mess, and went straight to my workshop. I pulled out a fresh notepad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote, Project Nightingale. My objective was no longer to coexist with Carol. It was to dismantle her. Systematically. Completely. And with the same cold, efficient precision she had used to attack me. The time for being the reasonable, peace-seeking new neighbor was over. The engineer was in control now. And I was going to design her downfall. My plan began to take shape, not as a messy act of revenge, but as a structured engineering project. It had phases, milestones, and critical paths. The first phase was data acquisition. I needed more than just a suspicion about her financial crimes. I needed undeniable, documented proof. I upgraded my security system. The 2 cameras I had were no longer sufficient. I purchased 4 more high-definition, weatherproof cameras with night vision and motion detection. I spent an entire weekend installing them. One was positioned to get a clear shot of my front yard and the street. Another covered the memorial garden and the side of my house. A third watched my driveway and garage. The fourth was my masterpiece of covert surveillance. I bought a tacky, smiling garden gnome, the kind Carol would probably despise for being unesthetic. I carefully hollowed it out, installed a micro camera with a wide-angle lens and a self-contained battery pack, and sealed it back up. I placed the gnome in my front flower bed, angled perfectly to have a clear, unobstructed view of Carol's front door and driveway across the street. It was my little Trojan horse. Every evening, I would download the footage. It was mostly boring, mail carriers, passing cars, neighbors walking their dogs. But it was a start. I was creating a comprehensive, time-stamped record of every single thing that happened on or near my property. The second part of Phase 1 was to leverage the community. I knew I wasn't the only one who had suffered under Carol's reign. I needed to find others, but I had to be careful. Fear of her was rampant. A direct approach would be met with suspicion and closed doors. So I started taking walks. Every evening, I would stroll through the neighborhood, nodding politely to people, occasionally striking up a casual conversation about the weather or the landscaping. I never mentioned Carol or the HOA. I just made myself a quiet, friendly presence. My break came from a man named George, who lived 2 streets over. He was an elderly widower, always working in his yard. I stopped to admire his prize-winning tomatoes one day. We got to talking. After a few minutes of pleasantries, he lowered his voice. "I saw that letter she posted about your turbine," he said, not looking at me but at his tomato plants. "It's a shame. She's a nasty piece of work." "She has her ways," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "She made me rip out a 50-year-old oak tree in my backyard, he said, his voice thick with anger. Said the roots might interfere with the common sewer line, which is nonsense. The arborist I hired said the tree was perfectly healthy and nowhere near the line. But she threatened me with fines and a lawsuit. It cost me $5,000 to have it removed. Broke my heart. My wife planted that tree the day our son was born. I'm sorry to hear that, George, I said. The best part, he added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The company she recommended for the removal was the only one on her approved list. Charged me twice what a normal crew would have. I didn't need to ask the name of the company. I already knew. C. Enterprises. I thanked George for the chat and continued my walk, a new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Her scam wasn't just about skimming off the top of regular maintenance fees. It was extortion. She was creating problems and then selling the solutions through her own company. Phase 2 of my plan was to set the trap. I needed to bait her into overplaying her hand, into creating a fresh paper trail of her corruption that was so blatant it couldn't be ignored. The upcoming annual HOA meeting was the perfect venue. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I went online and got 3 detailed, official quotes from the largest and most reputable landscaping companies in the city. I asked them for a comprehensive bid for all of Harmony Creek's common areas, mowing, fertilizing, tree trimming, seasonal planting, the works. As I expected, all 3 quotes came in at nearly half of what the HOA was paying C. Enterprises. The discrepancy was staggering. Carol wasn't just skimming, she was gouging. I also prepared a short presentation. I wasn't going to accuse her of anything directly. That would put everyone on the defensive. Instead, I would frame my proposal as a concerned homeowner trying to save the community money. It would be a cost-saving initiative. I made slides with charts and graphs comparing the bids. It was dry, boring, and utterly damning. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. It was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. About 20 people showed up, which was apparently a large turnout. Most of them looked either bored or terrified. Carol sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her 2 board members, a mousy woman named Brenda and a grumpy-looking man named Stan. Carol ran the meeting with an iron fist, rushing through the agenda, tolerating no questions. When she got to the new business portion, I raised my hand. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing. Yes, Mr. Pendleton. I have a proposal I'd like to present, I said calmly, standing up. It concerns the budget, specifically our landscaping expenditures, which are our single largest expense. I could see a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a condescending smile. The floor is yours. Please be brief. I walked to the front of the room and handed out copies of my proposal. I didn't use a projector. I wanted them to hold the evidence in their hands. As you can all see, I began, my voice steady and professional, I've taken the liberty of soliciting bids from 3 of the city's top-rated landscaping firms for the annual maintenance of our common areas. Their bids are detailed on page 2. You will note that, on average, they are 48% lower than our current contractor's fees. A murmur went through the small crowd. People were leaning forward, looking at the numbers. They might have been afraid of her, but they all understood money. I propose that we open the landscaping contract to a competitive bidding process to ensure we are being fiscally responsible with our community's funds, I concluded. This could result in a significant reduction in our annual dues. I sat down. The silence was thick. I had thrown a grenade disguised as a financial report into the middle of the room. Carol was staring at the papers in her hand, her knuckles white. She was trapped. She couldn't just dismiss it. I had framed it as a way to save everyone money. To argue against it would be to argue for higher dues. Thank you for your diligence, Mr. Pendleton, she said, her voice tight. However, what you don't understand is that our current contractor, C. Enterprises, provides a number of specialized services that these other companies simply do not offer. This was the moment I was waiting for. The lie. Could you elaborate on those specialized services? I asked, my tone one of polite curiosity. They are not itemized in the budget. Well, she began, floundering, they provide 24-hour emergency response for fallen trees. And specialized pest control for the green belt. It's a comprehensive, premium service. You get what you pay for. She was fabricating on the spot. I had her on video, recorded from my seat on my phone. Her lies were now documented. George, the man with the tomato garden, cleared his throat from the back of the room. I'm sorry, Carol, but when you made me cut down my oak tree, Enterprises told me they don't do emergency removals. I had to call someone else. The air went out of Carol like a punctured tire. Her eyes darted from George to me. She saw a coup forming. This is not the time or place to discuss contractual details, she snapped, regaining her composure. The board will take your proposal under advisement. Now, if there's no other new business. She tried to move on, but the damage was done. I had planted a seed of doubt. For the first time, the other residents saw that she could be challenged. They saw the numbers on the page, and they saw her flustered, dishonest response. I left the meeting feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. The trap had been sprung. I hadn't exposed her yet, but I had forced her to lie in a public forum. I had it on record. It was the first crack in her concrete facade. The next morning, I made my next move. I compiled my research on Enterprises, the public business filing showing her as the owner, and the quotes from the other companies. I wrote a simple, factual letter. Dear members of the Harmony Creek community, it began. In follow-up to the discussion at last night's meeting, I wanted to provide some additional information for your consideration regarding our landscaping contract. I laid out the facts without any accusation. I presented the cost difference. Then, I included a copy of the public record showing Carol's ownership of Enterprises. I ended the letter with a simple question: in the interest of transparency and to avoid any potential conflict of interest, I believe the community deserves a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances. I made 50 copies. I walked through the neighborhood and put one in every single mailbox. The fallout was immediate. My phone started ringing. It was neighbors, whispering their support, telling me their own horror stories about Carol. The community's social media page, once a ghost town of her announcements, exploded with questions and accusations. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a healthy dose of outrage. Carol's reaction was predictable. She went nuclear. That afternoon, a tow truck showed up and hooked my car, which was parked perfectly legally in my own driveway. The driver had a work order signed by Carol, claiming it was in violation of a rule about visible vehicle repairs because I had the hood up the day before while checking my oil. I had to pay $300 to get it back from the impound lot. The next day, I received a certified letter from a law firm. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of defamation, harassment, and libel against Carol. It threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit if I did not issue a public retraction and apology. She was trying to bury me in legal fees and intimidation. It was a classic bully tactic. What she didn't know was that my daughter, Sarah, was a corporate lawyer. I forwarded the letter to her. 20 minutes later, she called me back, laughing. "Dad, this is garbage," she said. "It's a scare tactic. There's not a single valid legal claim in here. You presented public facts and asked questions. That's not libel. Let me draft a response. We'll send it back to them and they'll crawl back under their rock." But Carol wasn't done. Feeling her power base crumble, she escalated her attacks to a viciously personal level. She started a smear campaign. She told a neighbor, who then told Frank, who then told me, that she was concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior. She hinted that a lonely old man like me, with all my strange equipment, might be a danger to the neighborhood children. The insinuation was vile, a poisoned dart aimed at my character. It was the desperate act of a cornered animal. She was trying to make me a pariah, to isolate me so she could finish me off. She filed for a restraining order against me, claiming she felt threatened by my stalking and harassment. The court date was set for 2 weeks away. She also slapped a lien on my house for the unpaid fines for the Turbine, which had now ballooned with late fees and penalties to over $5,000. I was now facing a lawsuit, a restraining order, and a lien on my home. A lesser person might have buckled. But I wasn't intimidated. I was energized. Every move she made was just more evidence for the file I was building. Her frantic, unhinged attacks were the death throes of her regime. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would elevate this from a simple case of HOA fraud to a major criminal investigation, came from the most unexpected source. One evening, a week before the court date, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young man in his early 20s standing on my porch. He looked nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder at Carol's house across the street. "Mr. Pendleton," he asked. "My name is David. I'm Carol Brewster's son." I was stunned. I invited him in, and we sat at my kitchen table. "I don't live here anymore," he began, his voice low. "I had a falling out with my mother years ago. I'm just here visiting my grandmother. But I've seen what's been happening. I've seen the letters, the posts online." He looked me in the eye. "I need you to know, it's so much worse than you think." For the next hour, David laid it all out. The C Enterprises scam was just the tip of the iceberg. For years, Carol had been running multiple rackets. She had a deal with a local roofing company. Every time a hailstorm came through, she would inspect the roofs in the neighborhood and mandate repairs from her preferred, and only, approved vendor, who would then give her a 10% kickback on every job. She had rigged the bidding process for a major common area repaving project, ensuring her brother's construction company won the contract at an inflated price. She was taking money from the HOA's reserve fund and using it for personal expenses, covering her tracks with forged invoices and cooked books. "She thinks she's untouchable," David said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and shame. "She brags about it. She calls the homeowners her little sheep and their dues her allowance. Can you prove any of this?" I asked, my heart pounding. He nodded grimly. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and slid it across the table. "My mom isn't very tech-savvy," he explained. "She uses an old family desktop computer for all her business. She never logs out. I was on it earlier, trying to find some old family photos for my grandma. I found everything. Bank statements, emails between her and the roofer, spreadsheets where she tracks the kickbacks. It's all on here." I took the flash drive. It felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of justice. "Why are you doing this, David?" I asked him gently. He looked down at his hands. "Because it's wrong. Because she's a thief. And because she used the money she stole from this place, from people like George who she forced to cut down his tree, to pay for my college education. I didn't know it then, but I know it now. I can't live with that." After he left, I plugged the flash drive into my computer. It was all there. A decade of systematic fraud, laid out in meticulous, damning detail. Emails where she explicitly discussed kickback percentages. Scanned copies of checks from vendors made out to her personally. Bank records showing transfers from the HOA account to her C Enterprises account, and then directly to a personal investment portfolio. This was the smoking gun. This was checkmate. The next morning, I didn't call the local police. Frank had advised against it. He said that local departments are sometimes hesitant to get involved in HOA disputes, and there was always the chance she had a friend on the force. This was bigger than that. This was wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. These were federal and state crimes. I spent the entire day compiling my final report. I organized everything into a single, comprehensive dossier. It included my initial research, the video of her lying at the HOA meeting, a log of her harassment campaign, the tow truck receipt, the lawyer's letter, a copy of the lien, and all the evidence from David's flash drive. I printed and organized it all into a thick binder, with tabbed sections and a table of contents. It was the most important project proposal of my life. The following morning, I put on a suit and drove downtown to the state attorney general's office. I asked to speak with someone in the Economic Crimes Division. After a short wait, I was shown into the office of a sharp, no-nonsense investigator named Martinez. I didn't give him a long, emotional story. I just put the binder on his desk. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," I said. "I believe the president of my homeowners association is running a criminal enterprise. Everything you need to know is in there." He opened the binder. He started flipping through the pages, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to intense interest. He stopped at the bank statements from David's flash drive. He looked up at me. "Mr. Pendleton," he said slowly, "would you be willing to give a formal statement?" I'd be happy to, I replied. The final showdown was set for the special HOA meeting Carol had called. The official purpose of the meeting was to vote on foreclosing the lien on my house. Her stated goal was to make an example of me, to crush the rebellion I had started by taking my home. It was meant to be her victory lap, her public execution of the men who dared to question her. She had unwittingly set the perfect stage for her own downfall. I had been in close contact with investigator Martinez. He and his team had spent the last week quietly building their case. They had subpoenaed the HOA's official bank records, which matched the files David had given me perfectly. They had interviewed the roofer, who had folded like a cheap suit and agreed to testify against Carol in exchange for a lighter sentence. They were ready to act. The meeting was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. Nearly every homeowner was there, crammed into the small clubhouse. The air was thick with tension. It felt less like a community meeting and more like a gladiatorial event. They had come to see a spectacle. I saw Investigator Martinez and another plainclothes officer enter and take seats in the back row. They looked like any other suburban dads. Nobody paid them any mind. Carol, looking smug and triumphant, called the meeting to order. She launched into a prepared speech, her voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. She painted me as a troublemaker, a threat to the community's safety and harmony. She spoke of the importance of rules and the consequences for those who flout them. Mr. Pendleton has refused to comply with the bylaws of our community, she declared, her voice rising. He has ignored official notices, refused to pay his fines, and has harassed and slandered your president. The board has been left with no choice but to proceed with the foreclosure of the lien on his property. It is a sad day, but a necessary one to protect our shared values and property values. She looked directly at me, a cruel smirk on her face. The vote is a mere formality. Are there any questions before we proceed? I raised my hand. I have one. All eyes turned to me. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I was carrying a laptop and a small projector. You can't speak, Carol snapped. You are the subject of the vote. You have no voice here. Oh, I think everyone will want to hear what I have to say, I said, my voice calm and carrying through the silent room. And see it. I set up my projector and aimed it at the blank wall behind her. I clicked a button, and the first image appeared, a screenshot of the State Business Registry, showing C. Enterprises, sole proprietor, Carol and Brewster. A collective gasp went through the room. Carol's face went pale. What is this? This is irrelevant. Is it? I said, clicking to the next slide. It was a side-by-side comparison. AC Enterprises invoice for groundskeeping for $50,000, next to the official quote from a legitimate company for the same services for $22,000. This is the people's money, Carol, I said, my voice growing stronger. And you have been stealing it. I clicked again. An email appeared on the wall. It was from Carol to the roofer. The subject line was, kickback payment. The body of the email was a short, terse message, payment for the Miller job is late. Deposit it to the usual account by Friday or our arrangement is over. Someone in the crowd yelled, the Millers. They had to take out a second mortgage for that roof. Carol was unraveling. This is fake. It's all fake. He's a hacker. A criminal. I clicked to the final slide. It was a bank statement. A direct transfer of $30,000 from the Harmony Creek HOA reserve account to the C Enterprises business account. A second arrow showed a transfer on the same day for $25,000 from the C Enterprises account to a personal investment account in Carol's name. The memo line read, kitchen remodel. The room erupted. The silence was replaced by a roar of anger and betrayal. People were on their feet, shouting at Carol, pointing at the screen. She lost it completely. Her carefully constructed mask of authority shattered into a million pieces, revealing the screaming, panicked fraud beneath. Lies. All lies, she shrieked, her voice a raw, hysterical screech. She lunged for my laptop, trying to knock it off the table. I'll sue all of you. You're nothing. You're sheep. It was at that precise moment that Investigator Martinez and his partner stood up. That's enough, Martinez said, his voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. He flashed his badge. State Attorney General's office. The room fell instantly silent again. The only sound was Carol's ragged breathing. "Carol Brewster," Martinez said, his voice cold and official. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement." His partner moved forward, taking her arm. The look on Carol's face was a masterpiece of disbelief, rage, and pure, undiluted terror. The world she had built, the one where she was queen and everyone else was a subject, had just collapsed on top of her. They pulled her hands behind her back and the metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. As they were leading her away, she twisted her head and locked eyes with me. Her face was a contorted mess of hatred. "You'll regret this," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'll destroy you. You hear me? I'll destroy you." It was the pathetic, impotent threat of a tyrant who had just been dethroned. I just stood there and watched as they put her in the back of an unmarked car, the red and blue lights flashing silently against the clubhouse windows. The show was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The rest of the HOA board resigned in disgrace the next day. An emergency election was held, and a new board, led by my neighbor George, was voted in. Their first official act was to unanimously void all fines and the lien against my property. Their second was to hire one of the landscaping companies from my proposal, instantly saving the community tens of thousands of dollars. The community itself began to heal. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Carol had cultivated for a decade dissipated like morning fog. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been afraid to even make eye contact were now stopping to chat on the sidewalk. Harmony Creek, for the first time since I'd moved there, started to feel harmonious. I followed Carol's case through the courts. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided and the testimony of her former cronies, she had no choice but to take a plea bargain. She was convicted on multiple felony counts and sentenced to 8 years in state prison. The judge also ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her house, her car, and all her assets were seized and sold off to pay back the money she had stolen. She lost everything. A few months after her sentencing, I was sitting in my backyard. The Nightingale 30 was spinning lazily in the gentle breeze, a silent monument to the whole ordeal. Eleanor's garden was thriving. The lavender was a fragrant, purple cloud, and the roses were heavy with blooms. I thought about the journey. I had come here seeking peace and had been drawn into a war. But in fighting that war, I had found a different kind of peace, the deep, satisfying peace that comes from seeing justice done. I had stood up to a bully, not just for myself, but for an entire community. I hadn't used anger or violence, but logic, patience, and the skills I had honed over a lifetime. It was, in its own way, the most complex system I had ever had to debug. And that's when I allowed myself a small, private smile, thinking about the final, poetic piece of my plan. The one nobody else knew about. During my deep dive into the county records, I had pulled up not just property deeds, but utility easements and grid maps for the neighborhood. It was professional curiosity more than anything. In doing so, I had stumbled upon a fascinating little anomaly. Carol's house, due to a clerical error when the subdivision was built 20 years ago, had been zoned on the power company schematics as a commercial lot, not a residential one. For 2 decades, she had been billed at the lower residential rate. A week before her arrest, after the Attorney General's office had confirmed they were moving forward, I made an anonymous call to the power company's fraud and compliance department. I identified myself as a concerned citizen and retired grid engineer, and pointed out the potential billing discrepancy for her address. I explained that the load signature from her house seemed more in line with the commercial tariff. They were very, very grateful. Carol's last utility bill, the one she received the week she was arrested, would have been a nasty shock. Recalculated at the much higher commercial rate, and back-charged for the previous 90 days as allowed by law, her power bill had more than tripled. It was a small, final touch, a quiet, technical, and deeply personal bit of justice that only an electrical engineer could have delivered. She had tried to take my home because of how I chose to power it. So, I used my knowledge of that very system to land one last, invisible blow. The turbine spun on, silent and graceful against the sky. The war was over. The silence was no longer deafening. It was peaceful. It was earned. And it was finally home.